So I'm just going to do a brief introduction and we'll get Rasmus up here. So I first met Rasmus Klein Nielsen at a conference on new media and politics at the University of London several years ago, where during my panel he asked me an incisive question that was so intimidating that I have since suppressed it entirely. But I left with the impression that has been reinforced for me many times that he is often one of the smartest people in the room. And he's also a wonderful person. I've really enjoyed getting to know him over the years. He's that rare combination of sort of good humor and frightening intellect. But more formally, he has a PhD from the Graduate School of Journalism at Columbia University, where he also taught at the School of International and Public Affairs. He's currently a research fellow at the Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism at Oxford University, and he's taking an assistant professor position at Roskilde University in Denmark. He'll be discussing his new book here, Ground Wars, Personalized Communication in Political Campaigns, which examines how new technologies are changing the art of political canvassing in American politics. So please, without further ado, join me in welcoming Rasmus Klein Nielsen. Thanks very much for coming.
Thank you very much, Josh, for the kind words and the welcome. You know what the joke in DC is that if Newt Gingrich is the smartest person in the room, you got to get out of the room. So it's great to have the opportunity to come to Quinnipiac. I did a lot of my research in the 4th Congressional District here in in Connecticut. So I spent a lot of time on the Metro North coming up from New York, and it was a real pleasure to drive through the beautiful city of Bridgeport again on the way and be reminded of the many hours I spent there in the Jim Himes campaign office in 2008. So the book that I've written is called Ground Wars, and what I'm going to do in this talk is to give the big picture view, if you will. The book is a piece of political ethnography. So what I did in 2008 was that I spent 10 months following 2 congressional campaigns, one here in Connecticut in the 4th Congressional District, which is roughly equivalent to Fairfield County, and one race in New Jersey in the 7th District, which is a district that spans 4 counties in New Jersey. It's sort of gerrymandered, but it's a pretty competitive race as well. And in the book, I deal, if you will, with the everyday details of the work on the ground in the campaign organizations. And if you're interested in the sort of the on-the-ground practical workings of congressional campaigns and in particular the field operations that rely on volunteers and paid canvassers, I'm very happy to discuss that in further detail. But for the purpose of the presentation, I just wanted to give you, if you will, sort of the big picture view of what it is that has been happening with what political operatives call the ground war, canvassing and phone banks, in particular the use of field operations to reach out to voters, to get them out and persuade them. So I'm going to give you a bit of history. I'm going to give you a bit of an explanation as to why it is that I think this ground war operations are particularly important to look at this point in time. I'm going to talk about why it is that these forms of communication are being picked up at this particular juncture in American politics. Give you a few slices of life of what they are actually like on the ground, and then talk about what the implications are of the practical workings of ground wars for American democracy. So, to start that story, I thought I would start with a number, which is a number that I personally found quite astonishing when I first was confronted with it, which is the number of people who, in the run-up to the 2008 elections, were contacted in person, either at the door or over the phones by people who worked for or volunteered for candidates, parties, or interest groups. The number is around 100 million voting-age Americans. Almost 100 million people were contacted in person by people who wanted to talk to them about the upcoming election. As you can imagine, this is a rather labor-intensive effort to reach that number of people, and literally millions of people were involved either as volunteers or as paid canvassers doing this work of making the calls, knocking on the doors for about $10 an hour. And of course, thousands more worked full-time as campaign staffers on organizing this effort, making it possible logistically, targeting the contacts, bringing together the resources that make you capable in the first place of reaching such an astonishing number of people in person. Now, at a first glance, a knock on the door or a call from a volunteer may seem like sort of curiously old-fashioned forms of political communication. Remnant, a ritual leftover from how we used to do things, something like lawn signs or bumper stickers, something we just do because it's part of elections. And the most basic thing I want to leave you with today is that that is not the way in which we should think about canvassing and phone banking. Ground wars are planned with the same care and effort as any other part of the strategic communication efforts of a campaign. It is subject to massive investments of staff, work, and money. It is reliant, as Josh alluded to in his introduction, is reliant on the importation of new techniques and technologies pioneered in corporate marketing that are used to target the context. So even if the encounter at the door seems sort of timeless, if you will, someone is knocking on your door to talk about politics with you, the whole apparatus that brings about that contact is as reliant on staff effort, as based on the investment of campaign funds, and as intertwined with new information and communication technologies as any other kind of campaign communication. So ground wars are not old-fashioned. They are resurgent, as I will argue. And they are important for how we understand the operations of campaigns and how they operate in American electoral democracy. They're also, I would argue, largely absent from how we talk about politics, both when we think about political journalism, but also to some extent when we think about the academic analysis of campaigns and political communication. So think about political journalism, for instance. If some of you have followed the Republican primary in the news, you will have heard many times that one of Mitt Romney's advantages over his rivals in the Republican primary was that he had a stronger organization. I would suggest that you have very rarely heard what that means. What kind of advantage was that actually? What was it that that organization allowed Romney to accomplish? What were the operations involved? Which kind of things did they engage in, and how did this help him win states on the ground? In the same way, if we turn to the literature on American politics, on campaigns and elections, take what I'll call the dominant narrative, one that is integrated in most textbooks, and those of you who have taken courses in American politics as part of your degree will recognize some of the tenets I will highlight of that dominant narrative. There are ideas like the idea that politics has become professionalized. It is, in the title of a famous book by Dennis Johnson, No Place for Amateurs. It is a tenet like the idea that politics has become mediatized, that the communications between campaigns and citizens is entirely reliant on mass media and increasingly on digital communications. It's ideas like the idea that politics is by invitation only, that politics is a process in which parties without partisans slug it out in front of an electorate whose only role it is to be spectators, to watch this, and then eventually to cast their vote, and perhaps donate a few dollars, but that have no active role as citizens in this process beyond casting their vote. In this dominant narrative, people's role is primarily the role of a spectator. They are targets for what political operatives sometimes call the air war, what is the parts of the campaign communication effort that is based on television and on spinning the news coverage, but have no active role beyond casting their vote and watching the spectacle. Now, I'm not going to make the argument that this dominant narrative is wrong. Actually, I think it gets a number of important things right about American democracy and how campaigns are waged. It is certainly true that we've seen the rise of consultants in recent years, and they are increasingly important in how campaign organizations are organized and executed. It is also true that campaigns have become more expensive and more reliant on paid media, in particular as the news organizations that used to cover politics are withering away in many places. It is also true that many of the local party organizations and civic associations that have historically involved people, engaged people in the political process beyond the casting of their vote as active citizens are withering away and breaking down in many parts of the country. There are exceptions to this, but the local party organization in your hometown, the local union, or the local fraternal society are not what they used to be in terms of their membership, in terms of their reach in society, in terms of their ability to engage people actively in the political process. But what I think is missing, if you will, from this dominant narrative, which I don't think is wrong, I said, but I think is incomplete, is what we might call the resurgence of ground wars, the increasing importance that political campaigns assign to field operations, to canvassing, to phone banking, to volunteer efforts. It is a resurgence that starts out, if you will, with a change in the thinking of political operatives who in the 80s and 90s were pretty much of the view that field operations was something you could leave to activists, if you will. It was a minor part of a larger campaign strategy and not a central part of the strategic calculations of competitive and well-funded campaigns. Now this is changing, and I'll give you just one example of this. This is a quote from the campaign biography of David Plouffe, who of course famously was the campaign manager for Obama for America in 2008. And notice the way in which Plouffe talks about the volunteer effort, the canvassing efforts, the phone banking efforts, as a medium, a platform via which the campaign reached out to voters that they wanted to communicate with, an integral part of a larger strategic communications effort, a platform on par with TV, with the internet, with direct mail, part of a larger communication effort. This is a change in the thinking of political operatives, the way in which they view volunteers and paid canvassers as part of the campaign organization and effort. This change in the thinking of operatives has been accompanied by a change in how campaigns and party organizations allocate resources. So this is not simply about how they view people, it is also about how they allocate the finite resources available to campaigns, where they make bigger investments in field operations than they have for years and years. To just give one sense, if you will, of the scale of this change in investment, in 2004, after the general election, Matthew Dowd, who was one of the senior advisors for the Bush-Cheney re-election effort, explained that the 2004 Bush-Cheney campaign had spent 5 times as much money on their field operations and their volunteer mobilization efforts as they had in 2000. 5 times as much money 4 years later. Together, this change in the thinking of political operatives and the way in which they allocate resources, together it represents a change in emphasis, where campaigns today are increasingly keen on getting people actively involved in the electoral process beyond casting their vote in competitive races where they need help to wage ground wars. Now, one of the reasons Plouffe is on the screen here, of course, is that the Obama campaign in 2008, if you will, is the poster child for this. It is probably the image that springs to mind for most of you if you think about canvassing, volunteer efforts, field operations in an American campaign setting. You will think about the Obama effort and the massive volunteer mobilization around that extraordinary campaign. Now, I think it is important to appreciate the development of ground wars and how they have changed American campaigns over the last 15 years, to keep in mind that the resurgence of ground wars predates that campaign. It predates even Barack Obama's run for the Senate. Actually, it, in my view, is a resurgence of ground wars that starts when Barack Obama was a little-known state senator in the Illinois State Senate. It is a resurgence that I think we should trace back historically, not to the parties or to the candidate campaigns, but to the labor movement. In the late 90s, Steve Rosenthal became the political director of the AFL-CIO. It's the largest union federation in this country. And Steve Rosenthal's strategic priority as the political director of the AFL-CIO was to shift away some of the resources that the federation invests in their electoral communication programs from expensive television advertising and direct mail, which are still integral parts of their interventions in electoral politics, but to shift money away from that towards what he called a labor-to-labor, labor-to-neighbor, neighbor-to-neighbor, member-based communications effort, where the purpose was to mobilize politically active union members to try to persuade them to talk to other union members, to their colleagues in the workplace, to their family, friends, people in the community, about the electoral priorities of the AFL-CIO, about why the federation and its constituent unions had endorsed certain candidates, and try to persuade people to take this into consideration when they cast their votes. Now, this was considered a massive success within the AFL-CIO. A lot of research within the federation suggested this was a very efficient way of increasing turnout amongst union members and increasing the number of union members who voted for union-endorsed candidates. So it was a massive success. This was the perception within the AFL-CIO, and it was a success that was noticed by people who are closer to the party organizations and the campaign organizations. It was noticed, most importantly, by Karl Rove, who was the chief political advisor of George W. Bush and the architect, as the term was then, behind his election efforts in 2000 and 2004. And after the 2000 election, Karl Rove, he expressed his sentiment, his view, if you will, his feelings about the way in which ground wars had been fought out in 2000 on the ground as Gore and Bush contested the general election for the presidency, as labor envy. He envied the Democratic Party the assistance that they had gotten on the ground in terms of getting out the vote from the AFL-CIO and its member unions. And of course, Karl Rove set about to overcome this, what he perceived as a disadvantage, and build a field operation, a ground war effort that could compete with the Democratic Party in 2004. And indeed, in 2004, he built what became known as the STOMP program, the Strategic Task Force to Organize and Mobilize People, and indeed, of course, proceeded to stomp on the presidential aspirations of John Kerry, mobilizing in the process 1.4 million volunteers to work on the field operations of the Bush-Cheney re-election effort. 1.4 million volunteers. By comparison, the Kerry-Edwards campaign reported that they had mobilized 250,000 volunteers. 1.4, 250,000 volunteers in one of the most closely contested presidential elections we have seen. Part of the reason for the difference, if you will, was that the Democratic Party, and this is why it's important to pay close attention to how ground wars are actually waged to understand both their implications for outcomes, but also for what it means for how democracy is practiced, if you will, on the ground in campaigns. The Democratic Get Out the Vote effort, the Democratic Field Program, was built not around the party, not around the Kerry-Edwards campaign, but around something else called America Coming Together. Something that we today would probably call a super PAC, an outside group, a temporary organization set up to get out the vote on behalf of Kerry and Edwards. Now, of course, legally, ACT wasn't supposed to be set up to get out the vote for Kerry and Edwards because they're not supposed to coordinate with candidate campaigns. But I can safely say that now, since ACT was fined $750,000 by the Federal Election Commission for indeed coordinating with the Kerry-Edwards campaign. ACT was funded by big labor unions and by big liberal donors like George Soros and Peter Lewis, and spent $80 million on hiring 4,000 people to work full-time on building a ground war operation in the battleground states in 2004. They hired 45,000 people to work for $10 an hour, knocking on doors, to get out the vote for Kerry Edwards and other Democrats on the ticket. And they mobilized volunteers too. Only about 70,000 of them. The Wikipedia article has only 25, but ACT themselves claim 70,000 volunteers. So you have a sense here of the differences, if you will, in terms of operation. How do you organize that? Rove built a campaign around the candidacy of Bush. He worked through local networks of churches, conservative activist groups, and mobilized 1.4 million volunteers to help Bush-Cheney get reelected. Whereas the Democratic Party essentially outsourced the field effort to this outside entity that spent a lot of money and hired a lot of people, was led by very smart operatives, but managed to mobilize a much smaller number of volunteers. The arch of this history that I've sort of illustrated, if you will, with a couple of examples from recent elections is an arch that goes from a situation in the 90s in which allegedly the Clinton campaigns in 92 and 96 would turn away volunteers who came to the campaign offices because the operatives who worked in those campaigns didn't know what to do with those people. What are you going to use a volunteer for if you think the campaign is primarily about having the best advertisements and winning the battle for the daily news cycle? What are you going to do with those people? They were sent away. At least this is the story. To a situation in which in the 2000s, campaigns that are running in competitive races are positively clamoring for volunteers. They want these people, and they want them because they need them to put them on the phones and they need them to knock on doors. This is a radically different situation. And I will suggest that if you go to the website of any campaign that's running in a competitive race in the US today, you will find that the campaign is asking you not only for your vote and not only for donations, but also asking you to give your time, to volunteer. They need you. They need people. And this is a new thing. Why is that? I mean, why is it that in a situation in which campaigns have access to ever more sophisticated communication technologies, we hear a lot about social media, we hear a lot about mobile media, in a situation in which political campaigns raise unprecedented amounts of money. I mean, people are talking about the prospect of the president raising $1 billion for his re-election effort. Why is it that in this situation, given the resources and the technologies available, why is it that campaigns care about volunteers? I mean, why do they knock on doors? It seems so quaint and old-fashioned that someone would come and knock on your door to talk about politics. Some might speculate that this is sort of a grassroots romanticism. I mean, there certainly is a sort of a feel-good story that's being told about the Obama campaign and its genuine commitment to grassroots activism and getting people involved in the process and so on and so forth. And that may be the outcome of it, but that's not the motivation. The motivation is purely instrumental. The reason campaigns care about field operations, the reason they care about volunteers, about canvassing and phone banking, is because they want to win. And the people who design those campaign organizations believe that ground wars is an integral part of running a competitive campaign in a competitive district. They've rediscovered the power of what in my book called personalized political communication. So political communication that is premised on the use of people as media. The same way that you can think of television as a media platform for communicating a message to a receiver, you can think of people as media. People as messengers. They convey a message from a candidate to a potential voter. Now, in a way, we were supposed to think that this would go away. I mean, that with the growth of commercial media, with the growth of new media technologies, that people would play a less and less important role in processes of political communication. Actually, what has happened is the exact opposite. This graph shows the percentage of voting-age Americans who report in surveys in presidential election years only that they have been contacted in person by someone calling them up or coming around to knock on their doors to talk about the campaign this year. And this is only political parties. This doesn't include interest groups. So this is leaving the AFL-CIO out of the equation. As you can see, the rough average for most of the post-war period from the mid-50s to the mid-90s is around 25%. There are some fluctuations. It's around 25%. 96 is part of that data series, if you will. You have 26% of the voting age population is contacted in person. And then something extraordinary starts to happen. 2000, 35%. 2004, 43%. 43% of the voting age population contacted in person. 2008, 42%, probably indicative of the fact that the McCain-Palin campaign couldn't mobilize quite the same kind of campaign organization and campaign apparatus that had propelled Bush-Cheney back to the White House in 2004. So why is it that this happens at this particular juncture in time? Why is it that at the end of the 90s, the early 2000s, that campaigns start to invest massive resources in waging ground wars, in getting people involved as volunteers or as paid staffers in field operations? Why at this particular point in time? I come from Europe, and this hasn't happened in Europe. We haven't seen this kind of growth. Part of this is facilitated, enabled by new technologies that help campaigns target their communications much more efficiently and directly to individual voters, but those technologies are available elsewhere too. The mere fact that this is possible doesn't explain why it's happening. There has to be a further explanation. And I would suggest that we need to think about this in terms both of the political environment that American campaigns face and in terms of the communications environment in which they operate. So to take the political environment first. American campaigns that are running in competitive district face a situation in which they have a polarized electorate and low turnout. Now, low turnout, about half the population will vote, often less, in local races, in state-level races, in midterm elections. In presidential elections, we've had between 50 and 60% of the electorate turning out. So low turnout. In Europe, you routinely have 80, 90% turnout. Partisan polarization, well, that's a little more controversial. I mean, political scientists disagree about the extent of the polarization of the electorate, though it is indisputable that our elected officials are more partisan than they've been for years and years in the way in which they position themselves in Congress and how they vote. But it is certainly the case that people who run campaigns think that the electorate is polarized and act on the basis of this belief. So to return to Karl Rove for an example, in 2004, and Rove is on the record explaining this, his view was that if you subtract from the electorate those people who are so disenchanted with the electoral process, who are so alienated from institutional politics that they're not going to vote, no matter what you do. They just don't care. If you subtract, furthermore, those people who, irrespectively of whether they consider themselves Democrats or consider themselves Republicans, are in fact so fixed in their views, have such strongly held beliefs, that if they vote, they're always going to vote only for one of the two parties. They can't be persuaded to do otherwise. If you subtract all those people, what you have left, in Karl Rove's view, was 7% of the electorate. Those are the swing voters, 7%. That was his view. And he built the campaign operation in 2004 around this view. The whole purpose was what he called a base strategy to fire up conservative supporters, repress turnout amongst liberals, and win, not by persuading swing voters, but by getting people out to vote. So that is the political environment in which ground wars are resurgent in the US. It is about mobilization more than anything else. But it's also about the communications environment. It's about the communication environment in which traditional air war tactics premised on television advertising in particular, but also spinning of the news coverage, are less effective because of problems that are well known to many people who work in marketing, many people who work in PR. Problems like oversaturation, so sort of a factoid that's bounced around by marketing people in the US is the idea that every American, on average, is subject to more than 2,000 persuasion attempts every day by corporate marketers, PR people, and others who are trying to persuade us to buy something, not buy something, to do something, not do something. And you can imagine how hard it is to cut through the clutter, even with a well-funded campaign, when there's so much going on. There are problems like audience fragmentation. As we spread across media platforms and use mostly media content that we individually find interesting rather than relying on a few mass media, it becomes harder and harder to reach a broad audience. In the 70s, if you put your television advertising on the 3 national networks, you could reach 70–80% of the adult population. Today, you literally have to put your advertising on more than 100 channels to reach that kind of audience. So audience fragmentation, too, is a central challenge for traditional air war tactics. There are problems like the demonstrably limited effects of most mass media appeals. Again, this is well known. We know that it is hard to influence people's political behavior through advertising. You can do it, yeah, but it's hard. Now, against this contrast, if you will, against the communications environment characterized by oversaturation, audience fragmentations, and the limited effects of most mass media appeals, personalized political communication that affords distinct contacts. There aren't that many people who come to your door and knock on your door to talk to you about politics. Door-to-door salesmanship is tightly regulated and mostly banned. So most people who come to your door uninvited to talk to you are either missionaries, they don't reach 42% of the population, or people who want to talk about politics. It's a First Amendment issue. Personalized political communication also affords individual targets. Instead of the problem of audience fragmentation and the mismatch between media markets and congressional districts, for instance, if you run in New York, there are 18 congressional districts within the greater New York media market. So if you buy an advertisement, you are paying to reach literally millions of people who can't vote in your election. But with personalized political communication, you can reach individual voters. You know where they live, you know their age, their name, their address, their phone number, and you can reach out exactly to the individuals that you think you need to persuade or that you think you need to bring out to vote. And importantly, we have reason to believe that you can. Personalized political communication, in particular volunteer efforts, have measurable effects. And this is increasingly well documented by research by social scientists, but also, of course, research done by the political organizations themselves. No one has more at stake in finding out whether this works than the people who do it, who spend millions of dollars doing it, hire thousands of people to work on it. And it is increasingly well documented that a knock on the door from a volunteer or a phone call from a volunteer are amongst the most effective ways of actually turning people out to vote who might not otherwise have voted. So, personalized political communication has been rediscovered by the people who run and design campaign organizations. It is resurgent. We know it happens on a very large scale. We have reason to believe that it works instrumentally. So the question that I deal with in greater detail in the book is the nittier and grittier question of how does it actually work? What is it like to be part of this? What is it like to be part of one of these campaigns that talk to voters in this fashion? What is it like to have those conversations? What is it like to organize it? How do you become capable of contacting more than 40% of the population in person? How do you reach 100 million Americans by knocking on doors or placing phone calls? How do you target that effort? How do you figure out who you want to talk to and who you're going to ignore? All of these practical questions, which seem in a way mundane, are crucial both in terms of the effectiveness of these operations. Getting that right makes a difference. You can do this in more or less effective ways. But also in terms of the experience of American democracy. if you want to take an active role in the electoral process beyond casting your vote or donating a few dollars, this is what you can do. That's what you can do. You can go and volunteer, and you will be invited, indeed asked, to go knock on doors or make phone calls to voters. So how ground wars are waged matters for outcomes, but also for the everyday realities of American democracy. So think first, if you will, about the context themselves. I mean, some of you, have anyone here volunteered on a campaign? There's a hesitant hand at the back. Imagine you're sent out. You have a script. You have a list of things you're supposed to tell the voter, questions you're supposed to ask. But it isn't quite that easy when you have that conversation. Imagine that you're the voter, for that matter, whether you want to listen to that spiel, to that canned script that they'll be rattling off. And I'm going to give you a few, if you will, examples of what this looks like on the ground, what it's actually like to be part of this. And here's an example of an actual conversation between a volunteer that I'll call Paula. I use pseudonyms throughout the book, so this is not her real name, who's having a conversation with a voter that the campaign has identified as a potentially persuadable swing voter. Now, Paula is a partisan Democrat. She's a volunteer for a woman called Linda Stender, who was running for the House of Representatives in the 7th District in New Jersey, which is a very moderate district that has been represented by Republicans for a long time, but it's been very competitive and very contested. And indeed, Linda Stender was running not as a Democrat, but simply as Linda Stender. She did not use the party name in her advertisements or her literature. She did not use the party logo. She did not invoke Barack Obama in 2008 as she ran. She ran with a green color code and simply as Linda Stender for Congress. Now, Paula, as said, is a partisan, and she starts having a conversation in which she conveys her beliefs, her views of what she calls the old Linda, the Linda that she used to know, the Linda she has volunteered for in the past, and has a conversation with the voter in which she calls President Bush a criminal. She suggests that he has been undermining the Constitution, that he has handed over billions in tax cuts to the wealthiest. She's way off message. This is not what the campaign wanted her to talk to that voter about. But it's an example, if you will, of the interactions, the dynamics of these conversations. When you use people as media, those people will have their own views, their own inclinations, and of course, importantly, the voter has the upper hand. The voter can just hang up or close the door. So you have to take into account, if you want to understand this, that these are live interactions between living people, if you will. Think about organization. How does it become possible to do this? I mean, each of these contexts is a unique interaction between two living, breathing human beings. How does it become possible to do that on such a scale? How do you reach 100 million people in this fashion? A rule of thumb amongst political operatives is the idea that you can count on canvassers or phone bangers to make about 3 contacts every hour. So 100 million contacts, 3 contacts an hour. I mean, think about how labor-intensive this is. On paper, it looks simple. You have a campaign organization, you have an organizational diagram, there is a campaign manager, there's a field director who is responsible, accountable to this campaign manager, they have subordinates working for them. But these people can't do this on their own. This is the campaign organization of Jim Himes, who ran in 2008 and won the seat in the 4th District here in Connecticut. And his campaign was staffed at the end of the campaign by about 25 people, of whom about 15 worked full-time on the field effort. But 15 people can't reach all the voters that a campaign would want to reach. In a congressional district that's competitive, your target universe will be something close to 200,000 people. These people can't reach 200,000 people in person. That's impossible. To do that, to become capable of that, they are reliant on enrolling a much larger set of allies, allied interest groups. They have to enroll volunteers. They have to hire paid canvassers to do this for $10 an hour. They will probably come here and recruit interns to help with this work. It is a much larger entity that's involved in doing this. This is an episode from New Jersey, from the 7th District, where the staffers towards the end of the campaign are scrambling to find enough people to do this. They have very fixed targets. They have numbers of voters they want to reach, but it is a real struggle for them to mobilize the resources, the efforts, the number of people, buddies, as they call them at this point, where they just need warm flesh, to actually become capable of doing that. So for those with sort of a theoretical bend, if you will, what I suggest is that we need to think about campaigns not simply as the formal organizations, not simply as the organizational diagram, but as a much larger entity, what I call a campaign assemblage. When we talk about the Romney campaign or the Obama campaign doing certain things, it is not simply about the people who are paid to work for the candidate. It is also about their allies, their allied interest groups. It is also about the volunteers who are enrolled to be able to do this on such a large scale as we've seen in recent elections. Think about the targeting. I mean, how do you decide, given that you have finite resources, that it is incredibly labor intensive to communicate in this fashion, how do you decide who to talk to? Well, canvases are equipped with things like this. This is a map. Each dot denotes an individual voter that the canvasser is supposed to contact. And the canvasser will have information on this person, party registration, age, name, gender, phone number, sometimes even issues that they might care about. Of course, this is premised on a number of new technologies that have been appropriated for political use in the last 10 years, and this makes it vastly more effective. You can identify many more targets. You can target people much more precisely in terms of who you need to talk to. So targeting, you will have heard about micro-targeting, nano-targeting is, I think, the buzzword du jour, is premised, is a necessary part of how field campaigns are run today. But of course, targeting is about much more than simply efficiency. It has a darker side too, if you will. It's also about control. This is an episode from the New Jersey district where one of the staffers is sent out to a liberal progressive activist group called Democracy for America to try to recruit volunteers to come and help Linda Stender. Linda Stender, you will remember, the Democrat who is not running as a Democrat, but as Linda Stender. And the staffer is talking to these activists and explaining very upfront what targeting is also about. In targeting, you get what you are given. You get lists, and these are the people you're supposed to talk to. And here there is an activist, a veteran volunteer, no doubt, who is very savvy, who immediately sees what this is also about. So you give us the scripts and the lists, and we do the work. That's neat. So ground wars, the targeting of ground war efforts is not simply about efficiency, it's also about control. So I've given you a few, if you will, slices of the everyday realities of how ground wars are pursued in practice on the ground, the contacts involved, the organizing involved, the targeting involved. And the reason I use the title ground wars in the plural rather than ground war is that it's important to pay attention to the practical details of how this is actually done. Different campaigns face different incentives. They're running in different districts. Some, of course, are not competitive at all, so they won't bother about all this stuff. They will have different resources. They will have different priorities. They will have different ways in which they try to do this. And some of them will fail. They will not be able to mobilize enough people. You know, when I asked for a show of hands, only one person in this room had volunteered, which I think illustrates, if you will, the difficulties in getting people actively engaged in this process, even when campaigns genuinely want to get you involved. It is one thing to build a ground war operation, to build a campaign assemblage, if you are this guy, and inspire the kind of volunteer enthusiasm that we saw around the Barack Obama campaign in 2008. This is the president speaking before he became president at the Democratic National Convention in front of 80,000 people when he accepted the nomination, the party nomination. It is a different thing to build a ground war operation if you are this guy. This is Mitt Romney speaking in Detroit in a stadium that can house 65,000 people. On this particular day, he drew a crowd of 1,500 people, which is not bad for a presidential candidate early on in the season. But still, there was apparently a press photographer in the audience who didn't want to let the campaign control the visuals that came out of this. But what you can be sure that they will have in common, whether we are talking about this guy and the kind of volunteer enthusiasm that he inspired at least last time around, or this guy who so far has not been able to inspire quite the same number of volunteers to get involved, actually involved in his campaign, is that both of them and the people who advise them will be interested in these people. They need people. They need people because ground wars are integral to how their campaign operations are organized and run, are integral to the strategic and tactical priorities of the campaigns, are necessary if they want to win what will no doubt be a closely fought, competitive general election in this fall. They need people for that. They need to get people involved to become capable of doing this on the scale that they need. So what I want to finish with is just to highlight, if you will, a few implications, I think, that resurgence of ground wars that I've described to you, the need, the instrumental need that campaigns have now of getting people involved in the process in a more active role than simply casting their vote or donating a few dollars, what that has for how we understand the daily workings of American democracy, and in particular the electoral process. So the first notion I will highlight, if you will, is a counterpoint. We can return to what I call the dominant narrative, the idea that American politics has become professionalized, the idea that American politics has become mediatized, dependent on television advertising and digital communication for reaching voters, the idea that American politics is by invitation only. We can return to each of those points and reconsider them in the light of the resurgence of the ground war and the particular practical ways in which campaigns actually pursue ground war operations. Take first the notion of professionalization. When we take a closer look at how campaigns are actually waged, it becomes clear that we need to move beyond simply looking at the formal campaign organizations built around the candidates, the limited number of staffers who work, paid, full-time, often more than full-time, to get a candidate elected. We need to take into account the fact that candidates and campaigns are reliant on a much larger universe of allies, allied interest groups, volunteers, paid canvassers, and that the larger entity, the campaign, what I call the campaign assemblage, is by no means professionalized. It is a much more uneven entity that has a role for people who want to get involved. You do not need to be a political operative or a professional campaigner to get involved in these kinds of things. There is a space for citizens who want to spend a little bit of their time influencing electoral outcomes, backing a candidate that they happen to support, being active parts of the process. Secondly, the resurgence of the ground war challenge this notion of mediatization, the way in which we understand political communications, the way in which we think of the ways in which campaigns communicate with the electorate. It is true that campaigns spend a lot of money on television advertising. It is true that campaigns are very concerned about the news coverage and how they can spin it to make sure that they get their message across and that they aren't portrayed in ways that hurt their electoral prospects. It is also true, as many political scientists have argued for a very long time, that negative advertising and cynical news coverage has a tendency to reduce turnout and repress political engagement. But if you want to have a comprehensive evaluation of how political communication is practiced in American democracy, we need to take into account that at the very same time as campaigns are involved in bankrolling negative advertisements and feeding the cynical horse race coverage that reduce turnout and repress political engagement, they are also engaged in ground war efforts that do the exact opposite, that get people actually involved, that are directly built to turn people out to vote. And this, I would say, is the third implication that the resurgence of ground wars have for how we understand American democracy in practice today. It has to do with political participation. It is true that turnout has been declining for much of the post-war period. It is true that we've seen less and less active involvement in American politics on behalf of ordinary citizens. It is arguably also true that part of this is about the withering of the local party organizations and civic associations that historically got people involved in the process. Part of that change is about a period in time, several decades, in which political elites did not see it as being in their interest to dedicate resources to get people involved. They thought that they could run and win on the basis of advertisements, direct mail, that having money and consultants was enough. And this is changing. This is changing, and this has implications for political participation in American democracy, because it seems to be the case today, again, that elected officials who are running in competitive races, which are a minority of races in this country, but those who are running in competitive districts and competitive elections, and the people who advise them think, again, that it's in their interest, in their self-interest, to get people actively involved in the process beyond casting their vote, beyond donating a few monies, to get them involved as volunteers, to give them a role. Now, it's important to be clear-eyed about what that means. I mean, we're not talking about some sort of New England town hall democracy here, whatever that ever was. This is not sort of a civics textbook sunny optimism about the genuine character of political participation and how citizen involvement will change the nature of American politics. No, ground wars are instrumental efforts. They are thoroughly partisan in nature. It is about winning. But the way in which campaigns try to win by integrating ground war efforts into their larger communications effort provides a role for citizens a meaningful role, not necessarily a particularly enjoyable one. It can be tedious and stressful to have those conversations with voters, to go knock on doors, to make those phone calls. It may not be particularly pleasant. Voters are not always very happy to be interrupted in the middle of dinner by someone calling them or knocking on their door. But it is meaningful if you volunteer because you want to be part of something larger. It is meaningful if you volunteer because you want to impact an electoral outcome. We know that this works. We know that knocking on doors and making calls actually has consequences for whether people turn out or not, actually has consequences for who people vote for. So the resurgence of ground wars, it changed how we understand political organizations, it changed how we understand political communication, it also changed how we understand political participation, because this form of communication, in contrast to television advertisements, in contrast to digital forms of communication, in contrast to the spinning of the news coverage, is premised on getting people involved, and it provides a role for those people who are willing to spend a few hours of their time actually doing something to impact the electoral process through which we elect the people who run the government of this country. Thank you.
We should have time for questions. We have room for a little bit. Yeah, we've got plenty of time.
Based on the way campaigning is changing and the types of politicians who are really good at campaigning and kind of know what needs to be done to win an election, in the future, do you see America becoming more conservative, more liberal, staying the same? Do you have any kind of predictions for the way American politics is going to go in the future based on how good people are at campaigning?
I would say there are two different things going on at the same time. One is about changes in the demography of this country, which is becoming more diverse and younger. And unless the parties change their ideological positions, that is to the advantage of the Democratic Party. Now, what campaigns themselves do is working at the margins of much larger structural trends. So you can swing things a few percentage in your favor by doing things in a better way, in a more efficient way than the other party. In my view, there is no consistent bias in who are better at running campaigns. It was thought in the early years of the 2000s that Karl Rove had it figured out, that the Republicans were simply better at running campaigns than Democrats were. A couple of very good political journalists wrote books about this. In late 2005, early 2006, two books came out about this, one called Building Red America and the other called One Party Country, both of them making the argument that by now the Republicans had figured this out. They'd had a way of leveraging a small majority in the electorate to a permanent Republican majority. Now you'll notice the timing of those books weren't exactly perfect in that they came out of the year of the landslide 2006 midterm election, which swung both the House and the Senate back to the Democratic Party. And they came out 2 years before Barack Obama won the presidential election. Now, of course, also after 2008, there was this view that Barack Obama had pioneered a form of campaigning that was so superior to what the Republican Party did that he would win, easily again, and that he could secure an ongoing Democratic majority to enact his legislative agenda. 2010 didn't work so well. So, in my view, there is no consistent advantage to either of the parties in this. This is an ongoing arms race in terms of developing the most efficient campaign strategies. And importantly, it is an ongoing fight within the parties to be able to execute them. Because parties want to win and campaigns want to win, but they do not always agree on how to do it. And there are other interests at play too. I mean, if you think about the Republican primary, for instance, the people who voted for Rick Santorum or who voted for Newt Gingrich, or indeed the staple minority who vote for Ron Paul, they may not agree with Mitt Romney and his advisors and his supporters about what it takes to win. So there is a real internal battle over the allocation of resources and over what kind of positions you need to take. There's no transparency around this. There's no one clearly optimal way of doing this. But that's an ongoing fight. It's an ongoing development of new tools and techniques, but there's also an ongoing fight within the campaigns and the parties to execute things in certain ways.
Given the extent of social media nowadays, would it potentially, and from what you did mention in regards to ground wars and such, would things such as Facebook and Twitter actually be another level of ground forces as well? So do you think they're going to be a more instrumental element?
Campaigns are very keen to get their supporters to lend them their social media presence. So you will see a lot of, if you get involved in a campaign as a volunteer or a staffer, you will get a lot of requests to donate your Facebook status and to retweet things from the campaign, because the idea is that if they can leverage your social network through your social media use, that's a more effective way of communicating than them simply tweeting or posting on Facebook and whatnot. So there is a real attempt to do this. There are also attempts to get people to let the campaigns access their Facebook friends group, so they can match them and say, instead of sending you out to knock on doors or make phone calls to strangers, to take your list of, say you have 500 Facebook friends, and match that list against the voter file of the voters that the campaign is interested in communicating with, to identify, say, the 15 people that you happen to know that the campaign wants to communicate with. Now, as you can imagine, volunteers are not always equally eager to hand over this kind of information. Actually, it turns out that most of us are more comfortable talking about politics with strangers than we are with friends. That it is more comfortable for us to have an uncomfortable conversation with a stranger about politics than to try to impose our views on our friends. In terms of the larger question of social media, of course, one of the reasons that this sort of seemingly quaint and old-fashioned ways of communicating with voters by knocking on their door or making a phone call to them is that, in contrast to many other kinds of communication, this is a push form of communication. This is an intervention that you make in someone else's daily routine, whereas with mass media, and certainly also with social media, you are depending on people coming to you. Those are pull media. And that, of course, is the problem that face many politicians. Frankly, people don't care. I mean, so yeah, most congressional candidates are going to be on Facebook and on Twitter, but there might very well be people in this room who have more friends on Facebook than many congressional candidates will be able to attract, because a lot of Americans fundamentally do not care about politics. So if you rely only on pull media, you are in trouble, because people aren't that interested. You need to make the push. And that's what you can do with a personalized appeal. You can do it by social media or of various sorts if your volunteers agree to lend their profiles to this. But this is the large-scale way in which it's done so far.
I was wondering if you can talk about, so I'm interested also in the sort of technology question. And there are the sort of brand name technologies like Facebook and Twitter and so on and so forth. But I think in the book you also allude to the fact that there are all these sort of technologies that are not known to the rank and file. I might sort of recommend their system of phone banks and things of that nature. What sort of role do they play in this sort of thing? And how is canvassing different based on those than it would have been in the 60s and 70s?
Mm-hmm. So there are two sets of sort of specialized tools that are involved in how field operations are run and ground wars are waged in campaigns. One suite of tools has to do with volunteer management, essentially. I mean, they're adopted from customer relationship management tools that are used in the corporate world and are ways of just planning work shifts and making sure that the staffer who is responsible for coordinating volunteers is reminded, we need to give Josh a call to ask whether he's going to come to the phone back on Sunday. So those are fairly sort of practical backbone infrastructural programs that are used to help staffers coordinate and organize the work with volunteers. Those help them do what they're already doing, but they're an extension of well-known social practices. The more important set of specialized tools involved in this are the voter files that the two national parties have built over the last 10 years, in the case of almost 15 years actually, in the case of the Republican Party, and in particular since 2004 in the case of the Democratic Party. Those are voter files that take information from the public record on all registered voters. So name, age, gender, party affiliation in most states, ethnicity in some states, address, phone number in many cases. They take that information, they digitize it, put it in a database. They merge it with information bought from consumer information companies about consumption patterns, credit card use, magazine subscriptions, various forms of consumption. And then they add to it the accumulated information that campaigns have gathered over time. So every time a campaign will contact you to have a conversation with you, it's partially about communicating to you, but it's also about gathering information about you. What are the issues that you care about? What are the issues that you care about? And they keep that. They keep that in the file. So if you live in a competitive district or a battleground state, a swing state, they will have contacted you in 2000, 2004, 2008, and they will keep a record of what the conversations were about. And all this information is used now, it's subject to statistical analysis to create profiles of target universes of voters who are essentially the two kinds of voters that campaigns are interested in. Is the small minority of actual swing voters, the 7% in Karl Rove's view, the people who might conceivably be swung from one side to the other. And then the larger universe is what they call lazy partisans. So maybe we have a person who we have a lot of data points on that suggest that this person is probably fundamentally going to vote Democrat if this person votes. But we can also see from the voting record that this person has only voted in 2 out of the last 4 federal elections. Didn't come out in the midterm in 2010, didn't come out in the midterm in 2006. That person is a so-called lazy partisan, and that person is going to be a target. So the data that's been accumulated helps the targeting of individual voters. Of course, also it enables canvassing and phone banking, because what you need most fundamentally, and this seems so mundane as to almost be irrelevant to even consider, but what you need most fundamentally to be able to contact people in this fashion is their address or their phone number. If you don't have that, then all the rest is irrelevant because you can't talk to them. And that is not a minor issue, though you might think that that is easy, but it isn't. I mean, that is a major task to keep that information up to date. The rough number from presidential election to presidential election, so over a 4-year cycle, is that 20% of the electorate will have moved. And if you look at specific demographics like young people, minorities, poor people, the churn, as the consultants call it, is much, much higher, sometimes approximating 20% per year. So if you do not update that voter file over time, you're going to lose track of all those people, and you'll have to start all over again, and you'll lose the ability to reach the people you need to talk to. Now, how is this different from how things worked in the 60s and 70s? Well, it's different in the way that in the 60s and 70s, you would target on the basis of precincts. You would target whole areas, and then you would knock on every door in a precinct in which you had low turnout and a high partisan bias. So the rule of thumb was, if more than 2 out of 3 voters vote for one party, but the turnout is significantly lower than the turnout in the district as a whole, that's where you go knock on doors. But that meant that all the people who lived in districts that either had higher turnout or districts that were more evenly mixed were never contacted. They were invisible from the point of view of campaigns who did not have the kind of individual level information that campaigns have access to today. So this is a technologically afforded, technologically driven change that has come relatively late to politics, actually. I mean, this has been done for a long time in corporate marketing, and in 2002, when Mitt Romney was running for governor in Massachusetts, and his advisors who came from the corporate world, his background in Bain Capital and elsewhere, when they realized that this wasn't done in politics, they were completely floored by this. I mean, this has been done for years in corporate marketing, and they were completely baffled. And of course, immediately set about to import these technologies and techniques into the political world. But this is a crucial, crucial technological element of how it is that ground wars have become so much more important today than they were in the recent past.
Well, if there aren't any other questions, I know that Rasmus will be around for a little bit longer, and thank you all very much for coming. It's been a pleasure to have you here. Thank you, Rasmus, also for.
Thank you all.